Imagine an airplane that looked like it was drawn by a child obsessed with science fiction, rather than an experienced engineer. A machine where the cockpit is hidden in the tail, the engines are mounted on the wingtips, and defensive armament is completely absent. What is it? A brilliant breakthrough or a death sentence for the crew? In those years, German propaganda promised a wonder weapon capable of turning the tide of the war. Newspapers trumpeted about a bomber that would be faster than any Allied fighter and wouldn't need gunners or armor. But the truth behind these promises is far darker. Why did the project never get off the ground? What happened to the blueprints that vanished in the fires of bombings? And most importantly, could the P.170 have changed the outcome of the war if even a few had appeared? In this video, you'll learn how an engineer, called both a genius and a madman, created an aircraft that became a symbol of both audacity and futility. It will only get more interesting until the end, as the strangest, most chilling and intriguing details of this story await you. He was a man whose name was spoken in aviation circles with both respect and a smile. Richard Vogt seemed to live in his own universe, where gravity obeyed his fantasies, and aerodynamics turned into a mind game. To some, he was a visionary, a prophet of a new path. To others, a man whose ideas strayed too boldly from common sense. And in this paradox lay his strength. He wasn't afraid to challenge conventional designs, even if his concepts seemed absurd. In Germany of the late 30s and early 40s, engineers were seemingly driven into a race of marvels. Amidst propaganda and expectations from science, machines were required not just to fly, but to capture the imagination. The German leadership dreamed of a wonder weapon that would change the course of the war. It was in this atmosphere, where the line between science and fantasy blurred, that Vogt felt at home. His projects shocked, inspired, and most importantly, always made people talk. One such challenge was the asymmetrical reconnaissance aircraft BV-14. It looked as if it were built not according to the laws of physics, but by the whim of an artist. The crew's cabin was placed in a separate gondola on the right, with the fuselage itself shifted to the left. No one believed it could ever get off the ground. But against all skepticism, the aircraft not only flew, but also showed decent results. This experiment became Vogt's calling card, proof that there are no definitive rules in aviation. His fame was cemented precisely by this contradiction. He could see beyond the obvious. Where other designers sought to improve existing schemes, he turned the approach on its head. Vogt was convinced that non-standard solutions offered the chance to get ahead. His workshop produced designs that resembled illustrations from science fiction more than actual blueprints. Yet, within these strange lines lay potential. Germany expected the impossible from its engineers. And in this race, Vogt wasn't afraid to propose the unimaginable. His reputation as a genius and a madman wasn't just a catchy label. It reflected the essence of an era when one strange drawing could seem like hope for a turning point. It was from such bold imagination that an idea was born, which would later become a symbol of courage and unfulfilled expectations. The aircraft project we will discuss further, but even at the concept stage, it was the embodiment of its creator's spirit. 1942 was a time when the war demanded the impossible from engineers. Germany was losing air superiority, Allied fighters were becoming faster, and bombings were destroying cities and factories month by month. Against this backdrop of alarming realities, propaganda continued to feed the population with grand promises. A new machine was coming, so fast that no enemy could catch it. Newspapers wrote about a future super bomber that would change the rules of the game. It was then that Richard Vogt proposed an idea that seemed insane, but met these expectations. He based it on a simple concept. If a bomber flew significantly faster than interceptors, it wouldn't need defensive armament or numerous gunners. All it needed was speed and payload. Thus, a project was born destined to remain in the blueprints, but already on paper it was astonishing. The idea was designated the Blohm Nachrichtenbüro 170, Blohm Project 170. Externally, it looked like it had stepped out of a science fiction novel. A long cylindrical fuselage with the engine in the nose, a transverse wing stretched out to both sides, and two more power units on the wingtips. This configuration was immediately striking, breaking conventional notions of form. Each engine had its own 2,000-liter fuel tank, theoretically providing both range and continuous operation for all three propellers. Special attention was paid to how the propellers would rotate. The side engines were planned to spin in opposite directions to compensate for torque and improve stability. This solution was as bold as it was risky, as no one had tested such a design in practice before. But this was Vogt's style. He didn't seek compromises. He sought extremes. Propaganda immediately seized upon his concept. Articles about the P.170 claimed it would be the fastest bomber in the world, capable of outrunning any enemy. Not a word was mentioned about the blueprints being far from realization, the calculations unverified, or the design requiring extensive testing. To the public, it was a symbol of future victory, a promise of invincibility in the sky. In such an atmosphere, the line between engineering and fantasy blurred. The project lived not only in design bureaus, but also in newspaper columns. And Vogt himself felt increasingly that his creation must justify Germany's reputation as a land of aviation geniuses. On paper, the P.170 looked like a defiance of logic. Unlike typical bombers of the time, its fuselage was an elongated, smooth cylinder, culminating in an engine with a huge propeller. The other two engines were not placed on the wings near the center, as most designers did, but directly on the tips of the long, straight wings. This placement was immediately noticeable. The machine resembled something fantastical, as if a classic airplane had been crossed with an experimental laboratory in the air. This engine distribution had its logic. The weight of the power plants was spread across the entire wing surface, reducing the load on its center. In theory, this allowed for a lighter and more stable structure. However, it also presented a problem. When taxiing on the ground, such a machine could easily lose balance. To prevent tipping, the design included an unusual 4-point landing gear, one wheel under each engine and an additional tail wheel. The cruise placement was equally strange. Instead of the usual cockpit in the nose, the pilot and navigator sat at the very end of the fuselage, near the tail. This decision wasn't born of whim, but necessity. The weight of the three engines concentrated in the front required shifting the center of gravity. As a result, the cockpit ended up in the area where the tail stabilizers were typically mounted. But even here, Vogt found an unconventional solution. The horizontal stabilizers were placed at the rear, and the vertical fin stabilizers were moved to the wingtips directly onto the nacelles of the side engines. Visually, this made the aircraft even stranger, as if it had no conventional tail at all. Internally, the project looked even bolder. Each engine was equipped with its own fuel tank, integrated into the same nacelle. The enormous propellers rotated synchronously, but the side ones in opposite directions, creating a compensatory effect and increasing stability. On paper, it all looked like a harmony of power and speed, a meticulously thought-out system where every element contributed to the overall advantage. The result was an aircraft where balance was achieved not through cautious adjustments, but through radical solutions. Its form, seemingly defying logic, combined imbalance with symmetry, heaviness with lightness, creating the impression of a machine capable of cutting through the air faster than any other. Yet, its appearance also conveyed tension. A single incorrect calculation, and the entire scheme could turn into a catastrophe. At the heart of the P.170's concept was an idea that seemed revolutionary at the time: to abandon all defensive armament and rely solely on speed. This concept was called the Schnellbomber, the fast bomber. Vogt and the proponents of this philosophy had a simple logic. Why burden an aircraft with gun turrets, bulky machine guns, extra crew members, and tons of armor if all of it still wouldn't guarantee survival? Instead, the aircraft could be freed from excess weight, investing everything into engine power and aerodynamics to fly so fast that no fighter could catch it. There was something daring and naive about this approach. On the blueprints, the bomber looked like the embodiment of pure offense. No defenses, no turrets, just smooth fuselage lines and massive propellers accelerating the machine to speeds that were almost fantastical for the time. The P.170 was intended to take off, break through to the target, and drop its payload before the enemy could even aim. This abandonment of defense seemed like both an economy and a brilliant solution at once, as every kilogram of armor or armament reduced speed and range. Here, everything was subordinated to one principle: speed equals survival. But therein lay the illusion of invincibility. In reality, aerial combat rarely followed clear patterns, and adversaries quickly learned to find vulnerabilities even in the most sophisticated machines. Nevertheless, the very idea of a fast bomber in the early 40s sounded tempting. Germany wanted to show the world that its engineers could create a weapon to pull the country out of crisis. The P.170 became a symbol of this faith. The faith that speed could replace armor, that calculations would prove stronger than real combat. On paper, the P.170 looked like a marvel of engineering, as if the engineers had peered into the future of aviation. Its length was slightly over 14 meters, with a wingspan reaching 16 meters. It weighed around 10 tons empty, but at full load, it approached 30,000 pounds, a significant figure for an aircraft of its class. The heart of the machine was 3 BMW 81D radial engines, each producing 1,600 horsepower. Together, they were meant to transform this unusual airframe into an arrow. Under the wings, designers planned to mount a bomb load of up to 2 tons, a very substantial payload for those years. The aircraft could carry up to 40,400 pounds of explosives, while maintaining speed and maneuverability inaccessible to most bombers of the time. Complementing this were 3 fuel tanks, one in each nacelle, each with a capacity of over 500 gallons. Such a fuel reserve provided a range of up to 2,500 kilometers, allowing attacks on targets far behind enemy lines. The calculated speed was particularly impressive. Theoretically, the P.170 could reach 840 km/h. For a piston-powered bomber, this was an almost fantastical result, comparable to the performance of the best Allied fighters. The practical ceiling was estimated at 11 to 12 kilometers, an altitude where the air is thin and intercepting the machine would be extremely difficult. All these figures created the impression that Vogt had indeed found the key to creating an invulnerable weapon. On paper, the P.170 combined range, power, and speed into a single organism, as if designed not for the war of the 40s, but for future aerial battles. But all this existed only in calculations and diagrams, in that fragile reality where formulas offer hope and metal has yet to be tested. When Vogt laid out the blueprints for the P.170, German aviation was already taking its first steps in a completely different direction. Jet engines were appearing on the horizon, technologies that promised to revolutionize all concepts of speed and combat capabilities. While the P.170 was still being assembled around 3 powerful piston engines, engineers were working on the Me-262, the world's first production fighter with turbojet propulsion. Comparing these projects was like encountering different eras. The P.170 seemed like a last-ditch effort to extract the maximum from piston technology: 3 engines, an unusual layout, a focus on speed. But next to the Me-262, it all looked like outdated exoticism. Jet turbines allowed speeds exceeding 800 km/h without complex compromises in balancing and propeller rotation. Most importantly, jet aircraft had growth potential. They opened the door to the future, while the capabilities of piston machines were reaching their limit. Vogt proposed the fast bomber concept, but it was the jet fighters that were becoming the truly uncatchable weapons. The Me-262, even in its testing phase, showed that a new era was dawning in the sky. Its speed and armament turned aerial combat into a game with different rules, where even the fastest piston aircraft risked having no chance. In this context, the P.170 looked both bold and useless. It personified the belief that traditional aviation could still produce a miracle, but reality was already moving forward. Germany, having invested in jet projects, couldn't afford to divert resources to a complex and experimental bomber, even if it looked magnificent on paper. Thus, the blueprints of the P.170 remained a symbol of lost time, the last brilliant flare of piston engineering at a moment when the skies already belonged to jet propulsion. During the war, Germany lived in an atmosphere where every new invention was presented as a sign of impending victory. Machines like the P.170 were not just engineering projects, but propaganda tools. Newspapers loudly declared that aircraft with no analogs, capable of turning the tide of battles, would soon enter the front lines. In reality, many of these projects existed only on paper, but the very idea fueled an illusion of strength. The Reich's High Command realized the war was becoming protracted and sought a wonder weapon that could be presented as proof of technical superiority. Projects like the P.170 looked impressive: unusual shapes, record speeds, promises of complete invincibility. But behind this facade lay colossal research costs that rarely led to practical results. Hot debates raged among the military and engineers. Some believed such experiments were necessary. Even if the aircraft didn't go into mass production, the experience and technologies could be useful later. Others insisted that resources should be directed towards the mass production of existing, proven, and reliable machines. Examples included the FW-190 fighters or early jet developments, which could genuinely impact the Luftwaffe's combat capability. But propaganda demanded sensations, and thus, such projects always found patrons. They became symbols of the future, a future that never arrived. The cost of such illusions was high. Engineers spent time on complex designs, materials were used for prototypes, and the front remained without the required number of simple, effective aircraft. The P.170 became a prime example of this dilemma. It showed that Germany was willing to expend resources on technical experiments for the sake of an image of power, even if their real benefit remained questionable. To imagine the P.170 in real combat is to glimpse an alternative history. If Vogt's machine had truly taken flight, its appearance could have made a strong impression. Against the backdrop of the usual lumbering bombers crawling at 300 to 400 km/h, the P.170's swift silhouette would have looked like a weapon from another era. Its speed, theoretically approaching that of fighters, would have allowed it to cross front lines like lightning and drop bombs before the enemy could scramble interceptors. Imagine Normandy in the summer of 1944. Thousands of Allied soldiers on the beaches, with an almost complete absence of German aircraft in the sky because the Luftwaffe was depleted by then. But what if, approaching the coast, squadrons of P.170s suddenly appeared? Fast, like diving arrows, they could have broken through combat formations, striking landing ships or coastal depots. Even a small number of such aircraft could have complicated the landing and prolonged the operation. However, this is merely a hypothetical scenario. In practice, such a bomber would have faced numerous problems. Speed might have protected it in the initial months, but the Allies would have quickly found a response. New fighters like the P-51 Mustang or later variants of the Spitfire were already capable of similar performance. Moreover, the absence of defensive armament would have made the P-170 entirely dependent on its speed advantage, the slightest loss of pace, and the machine would have become easy prey. Most importantly, Germany in reality lacked the resources for mass production of such a complex design. Even if one prototype had taken to the air, there was no chance of seeing entire squadrons. It remained a paper miracle that existed more in the realm of possibilities than in the actual skies of war. Thus, the P-170 forever became part of a parallel history, a symbol of what could have been, but never was. Today, the P-170 is remembered only through individual blueprints preserved in archives and private collections. Documentation about it proved particularly vulnerable. During the bombing of Hamburg, where Blohm Voss was located, many papers and prototypes were destroyed. What little survived is kept in aviation museums and enthusiast collections. And every sheet of such diagrams is perceived almost as a relic of a bygone era. Historians studying the project often disagree. Some see the P-170 as the pinnacle of engineering boldness, an attempt to push piston aviation to its limits. For them, it's a symbol of the daring search for new solutions, proof that even in wartime, people didn't stop experimenting. Others consider it a dead end, a machine that had no chance of practical realization from the outset. For them, the P.170 is an illustration of how the desire to impress became stronger than common sense. In books and articles about the Third Reich's wonder weapons, the P.170 invariably occupies a special place. Its unusual layout and ambitious calculations make it an attractive example of how far engineering thought can go when unchecked by reality. But this is precisely what reveals the vulnerability of the German aviation program of those years. Too much effort was spent on projects that never saw the sky. The legacy of this strange machine is not metal and an unfinished aircraft, but memory. It has been preserved in blueprints, in rare photographs of models, in the imaginations of researchers and aviation history enthusiasts. The P.170 became a symbol not only of Vogt's courage, but also of the dead-end German aircraft designers found themselves in, trying simultaneously to chase the future and cling to the past. The story of the P.170 is a tale not so much about the aircraft itself, but about the time in which it appeared. It seems to concentrate the contradictions of an entire epoch, a desperate striving for technical superiority, and simultaneously, a blind faith in miracles that was supposed to replace harsh reality. Richard Vogt embodied in his project the spirit of an engineer unafraid to go against common sense. His works looked like a bridge between real science and the world of fantasy, where every new drawing could promise the impossible. Vogt dreamed of machines that would outpace time. In asymmetrical designs, in 3 engine configurations, in bold solutions for crew placement, his defiance of conventional ideas was palpable. He seemed to say, "Let's break the outdated laws, and new ones will emerge." But the world went a different way. While he explored the limits of piston engines, Germany was betting on jet aviation. And where the P.170 blueprints held hope for speed, in reality, the future was already arriving in the form of the Me-262. Herein lies the main lesson. A crazy idea can be no less important than a practical invention. It reflects humanity's desire to go beyond the possible, even if it never becomes metal in the sky. The P.170 remained a symbol of the unfulfilled. But it is precisely such symbols that remind us that progress is born not only from cautious steps, but also from risky leaps into the unknown. Vogt remained in history as a man who was not afraid to go against the current. His aircraft were strange, sometimes absurd, but behind this strangeness lay the courage to ask questions that didn't always have answers. And in this lies the paradoxical genius of his era. Between madness and breakthrough, between dream and dead end, between what could have changed history and what remained only on paper,